This podcast is part of the Big Heads Media Podcast Network. Go to bigheadsmedia.com for more great podcasts.
Hello, Cardinal Nation. Welcome to the third episode of the St. Louis Cardinals Unrestricted podcast. This is your host, Christian May Suzuki, and we're going to be doing something a little bit different this time. You know, with all of the struggles that the St. Louis Cardinals have been going through, it's really hard for me to say anything more than has already been said or that I've already said in the last two episodes. It's just the same old story, unfortunately. So we're going to do something a little bit different. With Yadi Molina hitting some big milestones recently, it's time to really take a look back at his career and at some of the numbers that he's put up and silence some of the doubters in terms of his Hall of Fame candidacy. For whatever reason, people don't really understand that Yadi Molina is one of the greatest defensive catchers of all time. And I'm hoping that I can use this as a way to sort of shed some light on people and really bring that candidacy forward. So the first stat that's quite important is the stolen bases allowed by a team since he entered the league in 2004. So obviously the Cardinals are the best team in that regard, but it's the gap that they have between the next team that is really surprising. At third, we have the Reds, who have allowed 1,312 stolen bases since 2004. And then, in second, we have the Diamondbacks, who are at 1,263 stolen bases allowed. You know, all those numbers are decent. But the next number, the Cardinals, is down to 851 allowed, which is obviously a pretty significant gap, especially when the first one wasn't even 100. If you take out other catchers, surprisingly, you get Yadi's number, which is even lower at 523. That's just remarkable in comparison to the rest of the crew, really. If you take the Cardinals' stolen bases plus the caught stealing, so the total attempts, it's only 10 more than the Reds have allowed stolen bases since 2004. So this brings me to my first point, this whole WAR thing. Well, it's hard for Yadi to acquire WAR by throwing stealers out if they don't steal on him. If his numbers are so low where the total number of attempts on Yadi Molina is almost 400 less, so basically a 33% decrease from the next team's stolen bases allowed alone, that's a pretty remarkable accomplishment and a remarkable showing of dominance. People will say, well, just because they didn't steal on him doesn't mean he's good at throwing out stealers. But if the difference is that drastic, then why is it that teams didn't steal on the Cardinals? There's only one real reason, and it's because they respected the man behind the backstop, and they were far more scrutinous in their attempts. Really, there are three catchers that I want to compare with Yadi today. Those are Roy Campanella, Pudge Rodriguez, and Johnny Bench. So these three guys are considered among the best in their class, especially on defense. And I'd like to take a look at some of the numbers in comparison to Yadi and just show that he is up there, if not better, than some of these guys. So the first number is the number of innings in between stolen bases allowed. So it's basically a rate of stolen bases in a very interestingly worded way. But the way it's calculated is innings over stolen bases. Simple as that. Yadi sits at around 32 innings per stolen base, with the average during his career being about 15.6. So pretty significant drop-off. Roy Campanella is the only one who is greater than that. His 46.25 innings per stolen bases is incredible, and it does correlate with the 57.4% caught stealing percentage that he has, which is the greatest of all time. But there are some things that we can compare Campanella and Yadi to in terms of the way that they dominated their respective position. But that will be something we get to later. Going into the other two guys, Pudge has 26 innings per stolen base, where the average in his era was around 14, a little bit less, 13.98. And finally, Bench comes last in this regard at 23.75, where the average of his era was 14.2. Now, before I move any further, I'd like to take a look at the Johnny Bench context conundrum, is what I like to call it. Johnny Bench went through some very interesting times in the league, where there were 4 major jumps in stolen bases around the National League. In 68 to 69, which were toward the beginning of his career, the stolen bases in the league went up 22.64%, from 667 all the way to 818. And then it jumped up to another 28%, from 818 to 1048 the next year. It stayed steady for a little bit, going up and down gradually, but in 73-74, it went up almost 30%, from 969 to 1254. And then there was another lull, where things sort of floated around. There were some mild increases until 1979, where there were 1,486 steals. Going into 1980, that number jumped up to 1,839, so a 23.76% increase. Now, the big question is how did Johnny Bench do during these big jumps? Because it's a good way to estimate how much better he was than the rest of the league. It's about how much he defied the norm and how much better he was than his competition. And one way to determine that is how well he did during these swings. Now, there is a downside to using this method to really determine the context here, in that he was a rookie in 68, so some of the changes in the numbers is more attributed to his development as a player than it is the changes in the league itself. So in 1968 to 1969, his number went down from 49 to 30 as part of his development, going from a rookie to a sophomore, which is pretty understandable. And in 1969 and 1970, his number only went up 2, which is very, very impressive, from 30 to 32, so a 6.25% increase. When compared to a 28% increase in the league overall, that's a pretty solid differential. Now, in 73-74, it wasn't as drastic. He went from 28 stolen bases allowed in 73 to 37 in 74, which is about 24.32%. So not terrible in comparison to the 29.41, but not something you would exactly call dominant. And then in 79 to 80, he went from 70 stolen bases allowed to 83, which is about an 18% increase. Again, not terrible, but not incredibly separated from the 23.76% that the league had. He obviously wasn't quite as dominant as Yadi, in that the Yankees and the Orioles both had less stolen bases allowed and more caught steals over Bench's career than the Reds. And obviously, Johnny Bench is in a little bit more for offense. But I did want to mention that this defensive aspect is definitely something that should be accounted for, because when you look at the average inning per stolen bases in his first year in 68 compared to the average innings per stolen bases in his last year in 1983, you go from 20.89 to 9.78, which is a pretty remarkable jump. And then you also go from 40.5% average caught stealing percentage in 1968 all the way down to 32.89 in 1983 when his career ended. So he wasn't quite as dominant around the league as Yadi, but obviously he's way better offensively. So I'm not trying to say that Johnny Bench is inferior to Yadi Molina as a catcher overall or as a baseball player, but in terms of defense, Yadi Molina was a more dominant, controlling the base paths, and was overall better than Johnny Bench. And that's just a fact. And I'm sorry, those are just the numbers right there. Now, a player who was equally as dominant as Yadi Molina, you can argue, in terms of the way he separated himself from the rest of the pack, is Roy Campanella. As I mentioned, the innings per stolen bases incredibly high, and of course his caught stealing percentage at 57.4 is the number one mark of all time, way ahead of the average 41.67 in his first year and the 39% in his last year, obviously. So when you take a look at Campanella's 5 best years and you see how well he separated himself from the pack, it is rather impressive. So in 1948, he allowed 12 stolen bases and caught 24 stealing for a 66% mark. There was about a 40% average among those that season, and there was only one person who really came close to Campanella in terms of his ability to dominate the base paths, and that was Del Rice, the catcher for the Cardinals? Yeah, the Cardinals. Obviously, it's quite some time ago, so he wasn't exactly a guy I watched, so I didn't know for sure. But yes, Del Rice was a Cardinal. And among those with 600 innings or more as a catcher, the average stolen bases allowed was 33. So obviously a huge difference, over twice as much as the 12 that Campanella allowed. In 49, it's kind of the same story, but not quite as big of a separation. He was 24-41 on stealing attempts, so that's 17 stolen bases allowed and a 59% mark. But there were two guys who were 17 of 33 for 52% and then 16 of 30 for 53%. So that's 16 and 14 stolen bases allowed, albeit with a lower percentage. And Campanella had way more innings than most of those guys. The average allowed stolen bases among those, again, with 500 plus innings, because that's a pretty good qualifier for that time period, was 21. So only 4 greater than Campanella's that season. Not quite the domination of 1948, where it was almost 3 times. But still pretty impressive nonetheless. And in 1950, he was 35 of 56 on stolen base attempts, so he allowed 21 stolen bases and caught 35. There were 2 other guys who sort of compared, 29 of 54 and 28 of 63, but it's just not quite within the same region. And he allowed 4 less stolen bases than the next guy and had 100 plus more innings than said next guy. The average for, again, those catchers who played 500 innings or more was 28. So a pretty decent amount, but again, not as much as the over 2 times, almost 3 times in 48. It was 51 where he really started going crazy. He went 34-49, so that's 15 stolen bases allowed. He won MVP that year and was just totally dominant. The average of those among 500 plus innings was 28 stolen bases allowed, and no one really came particularly close. And it was not the same story, but pretty much. There was one comp in 1952 where he allowed 19 stolen bases and threw out 33 for a 65% rate. The only guy comparable was really at 30 for 57 or 30 of 57 caught for a 53% rate. So again, not even close in terms of percentages. And the average stolen bases allowed among those with 500 innings plus was 30. Another big number. Not quite double again, but still a big number. At least big until you see what Yadi has done, of course. So taking 5 of Yadi's years, from 2005 to 2009, you see some pretty insane jumps from him to the next guy. In 2005, he went 25 of 39, so 64%, in 959 innings, which is obviously a pretty robust number, especially for a catcher. And he led the league in caught stealing percentage, and the next person with at least 500 innings had 22 of 55 in 951 innings. So he allowed only 3 more stolen bases in almost twice the innings. The next person with at least 959, Yadi's total innings, had 31 stolen bases allowed, which was Mauer at that time. And the average stolen bases given up with equal to or more innings than Yadi, 65. So, again, almost 3 times the amount. And a huge 40 stolen bases difference. It keeps on coming, I'm telling you. Even in 2006, when he allowed 37 stolen bases and wasn't quite on point, he was 29 of 66, so a 44% stolen rate, or caught stolen rate. But the average among those with 700 innings, besides Yadi, was 66.5 stolen bases allowed. Again, in 2007, 27 of 50 with 33 stolen bases allowed, but the average among those with 500 innings plus was 63. Oh, and he led the league in caught stealing that year, too, if you want to add that on to the resume. And in 2008 was one of his worst years. He went 18 of 52 and allowed 34 stolen bases, and for his mark, a pretty abysmal 35%. But again, among those with at least 700 innings, because Yadi is most certainly among that crew, 61 stolen bases allowed. So even in the years where he allowed a high rate of his base stealers to actually be safe, the necessary caution that needed to be taken by teams and the fact that they could only use their very best base stealers in the very best of situations to go at Yadi made it so that he just didn't allow that many stolen bases, even in his worst years, which is simply remarkable. And then finally, of course, in 2009, the last year we're looking at, he went 22 of 54, so a 41% mark, and allowed 32 stolen bases. But the average among those with at least 700 innings that year was 68.5 stolen bases allowed. I don't know how much more apparent it can be, the domination that Yadi Molina has had over his competition in terms of the base paths. The way that Yadi Molina has dominated the base paths during his tenure, not by catching stealers, but by forcing them to think twice before they even bother trying, because the arm of Yadi Molina is just so daunting. And that's just something that you're not going to get from War Freaks, because that type of dominance is not something that you see in War. It's not a stat that goes in. It's the fact that he allowed so many less people to actually succeed in stealing bases because he restricted their ability to run by being so threatening. It's just something that you're not going to see in the numbers, because his power was keeping the numbers off the board. So in terms of defense and in terms of stopping people from stealing bases, Yadi Molina, when compared to the rest of the competition, was as dominant as any catcher we've ever seen. And like I said, Roy Campanella, the number 1 caught stealing in the entire history of the league, with a significantly higher caught stealing percentage than Yadi. Yet, the dominance is the same, because that's just how good Yadi is in comparison to the competition. Now, the biggest opponent to Yadi when it comes to claiming the greatest defensive catcher of all time moniker, in my opinion, and the only person in my eyes that really stands above him, is Pudge Rodriguez. Pudge Rodriguez, he didn't have the innings per stolen bases metric that Yadi does. It's 6 less. But the caught stealing percentage is way higher at 45.68 compared to Yadi's 40.23. And sure, the percentage of 30.4 over Pudge's career, the average of the rest of the league, is a little bit higher than the 27.5 over the rest. Sorry, I shouldn't have said average. Over the rest of the league, over their career, is 27.5 for Yadi and 30.4 for Pudge. But the percentage increase is still greater. You have a 46% increase for Yadi, but a 50% increase for Pudge. So that is a dominant player right there. And when you look at the average innings per stolen bases in their first and last years, Pudge's league competition is way, way worse. The average in the first year of their careers is almost 17 for Yadi and 13.89, so almost 14 for Pudge. And then in the last, call it 2019, because Yadi doesn't have a last year yet, obviously, and 2019 was the last full year. So in 2019, the average innings per stolen bases was 19.18, so 19.18 inning per stolen base allowed by the average catcher. For Pudge, that number sort of stayed in the same realm as it was at the very beginning of his career at 14.73, so about 14 and 3/4 innings per stolen base. So the dominance is relatively similar. Obviously, Pudge had a lot more years where the numbers are inflated, but that's partly because of the volume that he had to face. For Pudge, he simply had to see more stolen base runners than Yadi Molina did. The 8 highest stolen base counts in seasons that Pudge played among the league were all before Yadi entered the league, and they were all above 3,000. Yadi Molina only had 2 seasons where there were 3,000 stolen bases in the majors. For Pudge as an individual, he had 2 years where he had more than 50 caught stealing, and 5 years above 45 caught stealing, and 7 years above 35 caught stealing, where Yadi Molina's highest is 35 caught stealing. So there were also, to that regard, there were 3 years that Pudge was below 30 stolen bases as opposed to 6 for Yadi. But Pudge never allowed more than the 67 that Yadi Molina allowed in 2016. And the 2011 season and the 2016 season really, really hurt him. Obviously, the 2016, he allowed 67 stolen bases and a 21% caught stealing. And 2011 was not better. He allowed somewhere in the mid-50s on 29% caught stealing percentage. Those 2 years are definitely things that critics and haters will point to as detractors to his career. But the fact remains that the numbers that he put up in those years were still below the rest of the league's average and was still separated from the rest of the league in terms of ability. And the fact that his numbers lie so far away from everybody else, despite having those rough years, and despite having not the greatest caught stealing percentage at 40.23, which is actually 215th among qualified catchers, the fact that he still has half the stolen bases that the next team has allowed over the past 17 years, it's just remarkable. The stuff that he has done, the magnitude that he has played, and that's not even talking about all the intangibles and all these other little things that these number nerds and these war freaks will sort of dismiss as not necessary, not relevant. And then, of course, there's the framing discussion, which I don't really want to take a stance on that. I think that framing is very important, but how it applies to war or how it applies to baseball reference or Fangraphs, or that's not something that I personally care too much about. What I do care about, though, is Yadi being recognized for what he is. And he is one of the greatest defensive catchers ever. He has the dominance with a single team that Roy Campanella did. He has the counting stats with 2,000 hits, 2,000 games, all with a single team. He has the rings. He doesn't have the MVPs, but he was in MVP consideration for several years. He has all the elements that make him one of the greatest defensive catchers of all time. And being a little bit mediocre on offense is not something that's going to stop him from making the Hall of Fame. It's just not. He is a force without being a force. He is someone who can stop stolen bases before they're even started. And I don't know if that's something that we have ever seen in the league or we'll ever see again. Such a ridiculous gradient between Yadi and the next guy, Yadi and the next team, the Cardinals and the next team. So Yadi Molina is a Hall of Famer. And I hope that this podcast provided some good stats to help you in your arguments when you have your friends and your war freaks and your number nerds that use these numbers to refute his claims to the throne. Please present this podcast, present these numbers, tell them what they need to know, because Yadi Molina deserves more respect from the rest of the league than he receives. And seeing these kind of numbers are really the only way that you're going to get to it. So thank you for listening to this week's podcast. I hope that you enjoyed it and that you can use some of these numbers in future arguments and discussions with those who are Yadi Molina haters and doubters. As you can see, the podcast has moved to a Monday at 5 Central Time release schedule, but as we move forward, it is subject to change. As my schedule changes in real life with my job, we're hoping to move this to a bi-weekly podcast. But for the time being, we are stuck on Mondays at 5, and that's how we're going to do it for the foreseeable future. Thank you so much for tuning in, and hopefully the Cardinals will be in a little bit of a better spot next week where we can talk about a little bit more than the past and we can look towards the future. Thank you so much, and see you next week. Go Cardinals.